George Stephenson is the most famous engineer who ever lived. The reason why George Stephenson is remembered, while the names of engineers of equal or greater ability are forgotten, is a simple one. He is popularly regarded as the author of the railway and the steam locomotive. Now, that's a very bold statement, but unfortunately, it's not really true. And in fairness to the author, he does recognise that. He later goes on to say that Stephenson never acknowledged the efforts of those other engineers, predecessors or contemporaries, whose work, in the technical sense of the word, contributed at least as much as he did to the ultimate practical success of the locomotive railway. Two of those other engineers were Murray and John Blenkinsop, and despite you probably not having heard of them before, their pioneering inventions paved the way for not just the locomotives which Stephenson built, but engines which powered forth the Industrial Revolution in Britain and beyond. As early as 1836, Stephenson was titled as the father of the locomotive, but I argue it was Murray and Blenkinsop who were the real fathers of locomotives. So join me at Middleton Railway as we look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. But first, we need to go back to the 18th century. For thousands of years, wind, water and horse were the main ways of powering things, and whilst the idea of using steam had been around for some time, and a lot of people were experimenting with it, the first machine to really harness it properly was invented by Thomas Newcomen in 1712. This was used to pump water out of mines and it revolutionised industry, becoming the standard type of steam engine in Britain for almost 70 years. It underwent a lot of improvements. John Smeaton from Leeds made it much bigger and more effective. James Pickard used a crank to enable it to turn a wheel, a very important development called rotary motion. But it was James Watt who most importantly and famously improved it in 1776, causing an explosion in popularity. As his business partner Matthew Boulton said in 1781, people went steam mill mad. Okay, so let's put a pin in steam for the moment and come back to it later, because we need to talk about Middleton. Middleton is an area of South Leeds which had been involved in coal mining since the 13th century. The mine-owning Brandling family from Tyneside acquired the Middleton estate through marriage and greatly expanded the works in the 18th century as the demand for coal grew, and kept growing. Leeds was a hungry city and the collieries kept having to get bigger and bigger to produce more coal to meet with the demand. Sometimes the sheer demand for coal outstripped supply. In 1792, the mayor proclaimed in the Leeds Mercury that, in response to a petition signed by 10 prominent citizens, he would hold a public meeting to discuss the best means to ensure a suitable supply at all seasons, bearing in mind the distress which was occasioned in this town and vicinity last winter by the want of a proper supply of coals. In 1793, the quota for coal wagons delivered into the city was raised to 64 wagons a day, 6 days a week. In 1803, that needed to be raised again to 80 wagons a day. Assuming that's 6 days a week, that's over 450 wagons of coal needing to be delivered to Leeds each week. Now you imagine that, but across Britain. At this time, the wagons were pulled by horses, and whilst that system had worked well initially, with this ever-increasing demand for coal, it became clear that there had to be a better way of transporting it. And believe it or not, the main driving force behind the development of locomotives wasn't the spirit of enterprise or ingenuity, it was horse food. Obviously, horses are expensive. They need to be fed and looked after, and this costs money. And during the Napoleonic Wars, with thousands of horses and horse food required for both cavalry and transportation in the British Army, the cost of buying and maintaining horses became extremely high. Together with the ever-increasing demand for coal, this became a huge problem for mine owners. Necessity is the mother of invention, and two people arrived at Middleton at exactly the right time: Matthew Murray and John Blenkinsop. Both were from the northeast. Murray had walked on foot all the way from Tyneside to Leeds in 1788 and started work in a flax mill, where he made a number of improvements to the machinery. Blankenstock was brought into Middleton in 1808 to improve production. Witnessing firsthand the rising costs and difficulties surrounding horse-pulled wagons, he began to think of alternative ways of transporting coal. It's likely that he was inspired by Richard Trevithick, that other great pioneer of steam. In 1804, when Blankenstock was still in the northeast, a colliery owner in Gateshead built a machine according to Trevithick's design, and it's possible that Blankenstock had heard about it. Trevithick's last machine, Catch Me Who Can, was built in 1808 and took passengers round a circular track in London, rather like a fairground ride, thus becoming the world's first locomotive to carry fare-paying passengers. However, though Trevithick's machines were certainly revolutionary and groundbreaking, they became groundbreaking in other ways. They were far too heavy for the rails. Made only of iron, these rails would break under the weight of the machines, and so these locomotives weren't commercially viable. The solution came from Murray and Blenkinsop. They devised what's called the rack and pinion method. Basically, the wheels would sit on the rails as normal, but the rails had little cogged teeth on the side, like one side of a zip, which a cogged wheel would grab onto and use to pull the locomotive forward. This method had been used by Murray before in many of his industrial machines, but it took the two of them together to come up with a way of applying it to a locomotive. They also added an extra cylinder, which no other locomotive before this had done. This made it work more efficiently, and in fact, every single locomotive made after it had 2 or more cylinders. Patented in 1811, it was tried out on a test track and then immediately put into service, as the Leeds Mercury recorded on that pioneering day in June 1812. On Wednesday last, a highly interesting experiment was made with a machine constructed by Messrs. Fenton, Murray and Wood of this place, under the direction of Mr. John Blenkinsop, the patentee, for the purpose of substituting the agency of steam for the use of horses in the conveyance of coals on the iron railway from the mines of J.C. Brandling, Esquire, at Middleton to Leeds. This machine is, in fact, a steam engine of 4 horses power, which, with the assistance of cranks turning a cog wheel and iron cogs placed at one side of the railway, is capable of moving, when lightly loaded, at the speed of 10 miles an hour. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the machine ran from the coal staith to the top of Hunslet Moor, where 6, and afterwards 8 wagons of coal, each weighing 3 tons, were hooked to the back part. With this immense weight, to which as it approached the town was superadded about 50 of the spectators mounted upon the wagons, it set off on its return to the coal staith, and performed the journey, a distance of about 1.5 miles, principally on a dead level, in 23 minutes, without the slightest accident. The experiment, which was witnessed by thousands of spectators, was crowned with complete success, and when it is considered that this invention is applicable to all railroads, and that upon the works of Mr. Brandling alone, the use of 50 horses will be dispensed with, and the corn necessary for the consumption of at least 200 men saved, we cannot forbear to hail the invention as of vast public utility, and to rank the inventor amongst the benefactors of his country. This illustration of the machine, later named Salamanca after a British victory in Spain, was published in the Mercury and is probably the world's first newspaper illustration of a locomotive. Over time, 6 or 7 locomotives of this type, with some later developments, were built and became essentially the first class of engines. Blenkinsop estimated that each engine could do the work of 16 horses in 12 hours. In a letter from 1813, he recorded that the cost of keeping 16 horses and 8 drivers was £1,360. That's about £63,000 in today's money. The cost for maintaining an engine and driver for a year, £160, or about £7,000 in today's money. The impact of this was tremendous, and in 1814 the colliery reached its all-time highest output, 100,000 tonnes of coal. However, if you've watched my Luddites video, it won't come as much surprise to learn that a lot of people weren't very happy about having their jobs replaced by machines. On New Year's Eve 1812, a group of them placed large rocks and loose rails on the tracks, which damaged some of the engines. So seriously did Blenkinsop take this that he offered 50 guineas, more than some men's annual pay as reward for information. But these machines could also be quite dangerous. At least 6 members of the public died when, rather stupidly, they tried to use the tracks as footpaths. In a rather macabre milestone, the first member of the public to be killed by a locomotive was the 13-year-old John Bruce, who was killed by one of these Middleton machines. Railway workers themselves could also become victims. In 1818, an inquest found that a driver of Salamanca had died after being thrown 100 yards by the power of an exploding boiler after too much pressure had been allowed to build up. This led to a bill in the House of Commons which made it mandatory for boilers to be made out of wrought iron instead of the much weaker cast iron, which Salamanca's boiler had been made of. Okay, so we have to talk about Stephenson. In 1813, Blankenstock gave one of his machines to a colliery in Newcastle. Named Willington, it debuted to much public spectacle and was said to replace the work of 40 horses. One of the witnesses was George Stephenson, who remarked scornfully that he could make a better engine than that to go upon legs, and immediately set to work on making his own engine. Named Blucher, after the Prussian general, it debuted in 1814 but could only draw 30 tons at 4 miles an hour, whilst Murray and Blenkinsop's original engine could draw more than 90 tons at that speed. Stephenson's son Robert, in a biography of his father published in 1862, admitted that the construction of my father's first engine was very much after the same plan as that made by Mr. Blenkinsop. So Stephenson basically stole the Blankenstock engine without giving due credit, and it's a real shame because for a time Murray and Blenkinsop became the railway celebrities which Stephenson is today. People from all over the world came to visit Middleton. The American William Strickland produced a detailed illustration of the railway in 1825, giving us a fascinating glimpse into how it worked at the time. It was featured in a leading French industrial publication. Engineers from Germany came and took the design back with them to Berlin, where they were the first steam locomotives to be built in mainland Europe. In 1815, the consul for the United States in Liverpool ordered several engines for use in steamships on the Mississippi. The Grand Duke Nicholas I, later Tsar, watched the demonstration and was given a model of the locomotive by Murray, and even the Prince Regent, later George IV, was informed of the machine by a letter from an excited onlooker. And what makes this even better is that at the time, Stephenson was jealous of the attention which Murray and Blenkinsop were getting. As his biographer rather scathingly wrote, Blenkinsop's clumsier and less successful engine excited far more interest, partly perhaps because it was close to the large town of Leeds and used to be visited by strangers as one of the few objects of interest in that place. Murray died in 1826 at the age of 60. On his death, the Leeds Mercury said that he was a man whose mechanical abilities were perhaps inferior to none. His great improvements in the steam engine, flax spinning and other machinery will be a lasting testimony of his unceasing labours. He was buried in Holbeck Cemetery and a cast iron monument was raised in his honour by members of the foundry. He never lived to see Stephenson's rocket debut. Blenkinsop died in 1831, reportedly from an illness acquired as a result of being one of the first rescuers to enter Gosforth Pit after an explosion there in 1825. The Leeds Mercury said that, as a generous and disinterested friend, his memory will be long cherished by a numerous circle of acquaintance. In his station as agent, he commanded the entire confidence and esteem of his employers, and also lived highly respected among the working classes, and died sincerely lamented by all who were in any way connected with him. He was buried at Rothwell, and there is no known portrait of him. Though the true extent to which Murray and Blenkinsop contributed to our industrial heritage would take too long to describe fully, here's just a few more of their career highlights. Murray was the first to have his works lit with coal gas, and instrumental in persuading the authorities to construct a gasworks for the city. They employed the world's first identifiable professional engine driver, a man named James Hewitt, who was trained and employed specifically for the purpose. Murray's house was the first house in Britain to be centrally heated after the Romans and nicknamed Steam Hall. He was also incredibly forward-thinking. In a letter from 1824, he seems to have predicted the need for what could be described as four-wheel drive, although this was never implemented by him. I don't see any objection why they might not be made to go upon a macadamised road if a motion was given to all the four wheels at one time and made with broad surfaces. Though Murray and Blenkinsop may only now be receiving the attention which they have always deserved, their influence on not just Britain's industrial heritage but the world's is undeniable and should be a source of great pride for the city. Though the full history of Middleton Railway is beyond the scope of this video, after years of decline in the 20th century, the historic railway was preserved by the pioneering efforts of the Leeds University Union Railway Society, spearheaded by Dr. Fred Ewell, who established the Middleton Railway Preservation Society. Through tireless hard work by volunteers, they created from scratch this free museum and charity, which remains a fantastic place to learn about our industrial heritage and a fun family day out.